The first time they saw what the McKinley children were building, the laughter started before anyone even asked a question. From a distance, it looked like a lopsided barn, swallowing the family's one-room cabin whole. Rough-hewn beams crooked as a drunk preacher's finger, half-nailed planks gaping like broken teeth, and strips of pitch-soaked cloth flapping between the boards. Most folks didn't know the McKinley parents had died the previous spring. They only knew the 3 children had stayed behind. No wagon, no guardian, no word, not even to the preacher, and nobody expected them to last the summer, let alone prepare for another winter. The youngest boy, Tobias, had been just 6 when the fever took their mother, and the others not much older. June, barely 13, was the eldest, and no one could quite believe the way she walked into town each Saturday with her jaw set and list clenched tight in her hand. When the dry winds rolled down from the north and stripped the trees of their gold, she and her brothers didn't patch their roof like most did. They started building around it. Not a second roof, not a lean-to, but something thicker, taller, stranger, like a wooden coat that buttoned over the whole house, a barn, with no livestock, just a cabin, cradled inside. And everyone in the valley, every farmer, every rancher, every church elder, with more children than teeth, took one look and declared the same thing. Those poor McKinley kids have gone and lost their minds. June had seen the way folks stared when she rode into the general store in late August, dragging a length of coiled rope behind her and asking about pitch tar, wagon nails, and old fencing boards. The man behind the counter, old Mr. Trammer, who smelled like boiled coffee and tobacco chew, had blinked slow. "What are you fixin' to build with that?" he asked. "A barn," June replied, cool and steady. "You got any stock?" "No, sir." "You fixin' to get some?" She shook her head. "We're building it around our cabin." He didn't ask another question, just rang her up and watched as she left, that rope trailing behind like a python too tired to strike. It had taken them 2 weeks to scavenge enough from the surrounding hills, another to drag what they'd hauled up the slope. Their cabin sat half a mile above the creek, alone in a clearing scarred by frost and wind, with the first real snow expected before November. The McKinley siblings moved like a unit, quiet, lean, sun-scorched, their motions sharpened by necessity and silence. There was no father anymore to swing a hammer, no mother to stir the soup. June did both. Isaac, just 10 but already wiry from a summer of hauling and splitting, manned the hatchet like he'd been born with it in his grip. Tobias watched everything. He never asked why they were building walls over walls, not once, because June had said it would keep them warm, and that was enough. Still, by the 3rd week, the walls weren't square. The gaps between planks yawned wide, and the wind sang through the cracks at night, cold as a whisper from the grave. But June kept swinging, kept sawing, kept binding the crossbeams with strips of burlap dipped in thick tar that made her hands sticky until dawn. Because June McKinley wasn't building a barn. She was building a skin, a shell, something strong enough to keep death from knocking twice. The first freeze came early, late September, just after the moon turned full. The pond by the ridge went glassy overnight. 2 newborn calves from the Larsons were found stiff in the morning, their legs curled under them like they'd knelt and given up. And the McKinley cabin, wrapped now in an awkward skeleton of pine beams and cloth-chinked gaps, looked even stranger under frost. Someone said it looked like a spider's nest. Another called it a death shroud. Some started calling it the cabin that got ate by its own barn. But no one said it to June's face, not after the way she'd stared down Caleb Anders in the feed store when he laughed too loud. "Let 'em laugh," June told Isaac that night, her fingers red and raw from pulling nails. "It's not their bones that'll freeze when the wind comes screaming down that ravine." And it did come screaming. 1 week later, the storm hit harder than anyone had guessed. The night it rolled in, it carried sleet so dense it turned the hills into grey blurs. Trees cracked in the dark, roofs groaned, fires died in half-lit hearths all across the valley. Even the churches went cold, and in the black belly of that night, the McKinley children huddled in their cabin, inside the barn, inside the storm, but they were not freezing. The air between the outer barn wall and the original cabin had turned thick and still. June had packed the gap with straw, burlap, and dried brush from the woodshed. There was no wind inside the wind, just a pocket of stale warmth that wrapped around them like the hand of a giant. Their single potbelly stove, usually struggling to heat the one-room cabin, now radiated enough warmth to make them sweat. Tobias peeled off his second pair of socks. "You think it's still storming?" Isaac whispered. "Hard," June said, listening to the outer boards groan. "But we're all right." No window rattled. No snow crept under the door. The barn wall blocked it all. That night, Isaac slept with both arms above the blanket for the first time in months. At dawn, The valley blinked into the sun with broken fences and frostbit cattle. Mrs. Ruther lost half her flock. Mr. Bellows found 2 of his eaves ripped off. The town preacher said the storm was a godly reckoning, a reminder of humility. But the strangest sight was the McKinley place. Neighbors rode up, expecting to find the kids curled dead under fallen beams. Instead, they found a strange double structure standing firm. The outer barn walls were sheathed in ice. Thick sheets of it, like glass, had been laid across the boards. But underneath, the cabin smoked with warmth. A small chimney puffed steady, and when June stepped out, coatless, she squinted at the sun and wiped her brow. "They're still alive," someone whispered. "They're warm." Someone else rode off to check their own roof. By noon, the first man came by, asking how they'd done it. June didn't answer. She just pointed to the beams, to the tarp-filled chinks, to the layer of space between. She didn't say, "I thought of this while watching Ma die with frost on her lips." She didn't say, "I prayed someone would come help and no one did." She didn't say, "I don't want to bury another brother." She just said, "It's not a barn," then turned and walked back inside. But the worst wasn't over, not by half, because that wasn't winter. That was just fall. The real freeze was coming, and by then, they wouldn't just need to survive. They'd need to decide who they'd help and who they wouldn't. By the second week of October, the valley had changed its tune. Where once there were chuckles and sidelong glances at the McKinley place, now there were conversations, quiet ones, behind church doors and over fence rails. Men who'd called the children doomed now spoke of innovation. Women who had once said, "They'll be in the ground by Christmas," now whispered things like, "Maybe I'll ask June how she patched her seams." The storm had made something clear that even pride couldn't deny. The McKinley cabin had stayed warm. Not warm as intolerable, warm as in livable, safer than any cabin built with rough faith and single walls. And that put a tension in the town nobody wanted to name. Because if 3 kids without parents had seen this coming, what did that say about the rest of them? Still, the mountain didn't care who felt embarrassed. The snow came early and thick. By mid-October, the trails that led up to the McKinley place were already dusted most mornings, and the creek froze each night with a skin you could break with a boot heel. Inside their double-walled shelter, the McKinley children were preparing, not for survival but for siege. "We got enough firewood?" Isaac asked one night as he stood near the stove, steam rising off his shirtless back. "Last storm, we barely burned 2 bundles." June nodded without looking up from the map she was sketching, a crude drawing of their land, etched with coal onto flour sackcloth. "We've got enough, but we'll need more once it gets serious. I want to build a tunnel." Isaac blinked. "A what?" "A crawl tunnel, from the back wall to the woodshed, maybe down under the snowpack." Tobias, perched on the hearth, dropped his half-whittled stick. "Like a mole?" "Exactly," June said. Isaac scratched his neck. "You think it'll get that bad?" June's voice was flat. "I think it'll get worse." She didn't say she'd heard the way the wind howled not just through the trees, but through the ground, how it pulled at the nails in the boards like teeth at a coffin lid. She didn't say she'd been counting the crows that circled overhead each day, more and more of them, like they knew something. And she didn't mention the man who'd come riding up the day before with empty eyes and a bleeding hand, begging for heat. That man, his name was Elliot Grange, had once lived 3 hills over, at the edge of town. June remembered him faintly, mostly from his smell. Grange had smelled like old whiskey and saddle sweat, and had once told her mother something about buying rabbits. That day, when he stumbled toward the cabin, blood running from a gash on his palm and snow crusting his mustache, June had opened the barn door with one hand on the axe. "You alone?" she asked. He nodded. "My woman and boy took the horse. Gone for days. I was fixing the lean-to when I slipped." He held up his hand. The gash was ragged and half-frozen. June didn't ask what made them leave. She didn't ask why he'd come so far without gloves or a hat. She didn't ask why his boots were tied with twine instead of laces. She just let him sit in the outer barn shell, the space between, and gave him tea, not inside the cabin, not where the stove burned and the walls were soft, but there, in the in-between, the liminal warmth. He'd looked around, eyes wild. "It's warm. It's enough," June said. When he'd slept a few hours, she bound his hand, gave him dried apples, and pointed him toward a town. "Don't come back without boots," she said, "and not at night." That night, she stuffed more burlap in the cracks. In November, the storms didn't just return, they moved in like permanent house guests. The cold became a presence, not an event. It didn't arrive and leave, it lingered. The sky stayed the color of wet tin, and every sunrise looked like someone had struck a match behind a curtain of ash. It wasn't long before they saw the first animal raid. A coyote, scrawny as a rake, came clawing at the walls. It wasn't hunting chickens. They had none. It was trying to get inside the barn walls themselves. It knew warmth lived there. When it failed, it howled until Isaac put a bullet in the dirt beside it. Tobias was pale. "You think they'll all come?" "Not all," June said, eyeing the woods. "Just the ones that are desperate." And sure enough, by week's end, there were fox tracks circling the perimeter. A half-eaten deer rib showed up near the outhouse. Something bigger had dragged it there, gnawed it, and vanished. June didn't let Tobias go out alone after that, and she started sleeping with the axe near the door. Then came the knock. It was late, well past dark. Snow was falling in that quiet, heavy way that made sound vanish before it could reach your ears. The fire inside was low. Tobias was curled asleep under Isaac's coat, and June had been sewing a patch into the elbow of his shirt when she heard it. 3 knocks, firm, too measured for a branch, too clean for a storm. She didn't speak, just rose, picked up the axe, and moved toward the inner door. She paused at the hatch they'd cut in the cabin wall, a lookout slot covered with oiled hide, and peeled it back. A woman stood between the walls. Her coat was torn, her gloves mismatched, and her eyes were wide in that way people get when the cold is too deep to explain. She didn't look dangerous, just lost. June opened the outer door. "Name?" "Sarah Grange." June's face didn't change. "Elliot's wife?" The woman nodded. "He never came back. I think he died." Behind her, a child emerged, maybe 5. His nose was bleeding from cold, and his breath hitched with each inhale. June didn't ask questions. She let them in, into the barn space, and pressed warm rags to the child's face. Isaac lit a second fire. They didn't bring them into the cabin, not yet. But that night, June shared soup and watched as the woman fell asleep wrapped in old quilts near the outer hearth. By the following week, there were 6 more. The Morrisons from Down Valley, a trapper with 2 frozen fingers, a miner's widow, and her brother. Each came like ghosts, stumbling into the McKinley walls, with eyes like empty windows, knocking with no strength left in their knuckles. Each time, June faced them, not with warmth, not with open arms, but with calculation. "Can you work?" she asked one man. "I can haul," he said, teeth chattering. "Then haul, but you sleep between the walls," Isaac whispered. "We're running out of room," June nodded. "We'll build more walls." It became a rhythm: shovel, patch, sleep, feed, haul, insulate. Tobias helped carry straw into the new extension, a 3rd wall forming outside the barn, now a skin around the skin. June called it the buffer. Isaac called it the shell. Either way, it gave them more space for fire pits, for kindling, for desperate neighbors who arrived in 2s and 3s and couldn't go home again. By Thanksgiving, the McKinley cabin had vanished under a kind of wooden cocoon. Inside, it was still warm. Outside, the town was dying. The preacher came next, not to scold, to ask. He stood outside in the snow, staring at what looked more like a wooden fortress than a cabin now, his scarf blowing sideways in the wind. "I came to see if you might let some of the children stay," he said. "Their homes are freezing. We've no more space at the church." June didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. Instead, she stepped out, walked around the side, and pointed to a corner where the outermost layer had begun. "We can dig down there, make a dugout. If we insulate it and use bricks for the fire base, it'll hold heat." The preacher blinked. "You'd let them stay?" "Some," he nodded, then stared at her. "You were always quiet, June. But your mother would have been proud." June didn't answer. She just went to get the shovel. That night she dug until her fingers bled, because it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about choosing who got to survive with them. By December 3rd, the outer dugout had become a room, not a fine one, nor a dry one, but warmer than the floor of any church or abandoned wagon in the valley. The dugout's ceiling, a frame of pine beams overlaid with packed dirt and layers of cloth-soaked pitch, held back the worst of the sleet. Its walls curved unevenly, and the floor sloped toward the center where water gathered if they didn't shovel quick. But once Isaac bricked a crude hearth near the back corner, the room became more than a trench. It became shelter. The preacher brought 6 children. All of them were gaunt, pinched at the face, their clothes stiff with weeks of smoke and cold and old tears. 2 brothers from the north end, a girl with a clubbed foot, and 3 others who clung to each other as if untethering might mean dying. Tobias gave them each a name when he thought they weren't listening. He whispered it to June like he was naming animals in the wild, not children. "That one's Cinder," he said, pointing to the smallest girl, "'cause she sleeps next to the fire." June nodded, but didn't correct him. In truth, She couldn't remember most of their real names either. The line between names and survival was thinning. Out there people were dying. In here they were clinging. And inside the McKinley shell, the cabin within the barn within the outer dugout, warmth had become something like currency. The structure was now something unrecognizable to those who hadn't seen it grow. From the hill above, it looked like a small settlement buried under the snow. The original cabin roof could no longer be seen at all. Over it stretched a webwork of sloped coverings, layers of timber and sod, makeshift chimney vents, and dugout tunnels now lined with canvas. It didn't look planned so much as evolved, the way a beehive grows thicker around a queen, or a snail adds layers to its shell. But it wasn't June they were building around. It was heat, that fragile, flickering thing that most in the valley had lost weeks ago. Inside the McKinley sprawl, a single central stove still burned day and night, the same rust-colored potbelly that had sat in the middle of their parents' cabin when their mother read aloud from Bible pages and boiled cabbage in the same pot for 4 days straight. Now, it was the heart, and around it, a growing number of souls clustered in layers. The inner cabin was for the McKinley three only, no exceptions. June had drawn that line with chalk and ash, not words. No one asked to sleep inside. They all understood. The barn layer was for the workers, those who hauled wood, repaired joints, kept the fires going in shifts, and knew how to listen. The dugout, now extended on 2 sides, housed the rest, mostly children, 2 widows, and 1 former trapper who had gone half mad and spoke only to the dog he'd lost a month earlier. That man, Ezra Tunnis, was the only one June had considered turning away. When he'd arrived, he'd looked feral, with a hat full of snow and a rope coiled too tight around his wrist. But it was Tobias who'd stepped between them and said, "He's not wild, he's just cold." So they let him in. And Ezra turned out to be the best fire watcher they had. He never slept through his shift, never stole food, and once used the last of his boots to patch a leaking corner in the dugout roof. Sometimes madness had its uses. The next test came the night the shell started to creak. It was the sound of snow becoming weight, of wind no longer gusting, but pressing. The roof beams bowed under strain, and the walls began to whisper. That eerie sound timber makes when it's thinking about breaking. June was the first to hear it. She was sitting by the inner door, re-wrapping her feet after another trip to the creek tunnel, when the noise came low, a stretching groan, like the earth drawing breath. She grabbed the axe and moved fast. "Up," she hissed to Isaac. "Get your coat. Wake the others." "What is it?" he asked, already pulling on boots. "Snow load." By the time she reached the barn layer, Ezra was already awake. "It's pressing hard," he said, eyes sharp for once. "Feels like it's going to drop the outer ribs by morning." June looked up. The main beam above the barn roof, a thick pine length salvaged from a windfall in September, was trembling. She swore under her breath. "We brace it," she said. "Now, get the hay sleds, the tall ones." Ezra didn't ask why. He vanished toward the back. June woke 4 more men, 2 barely older than Isaac, and had them drag the sleds beneath the beam. She grabbed fence posts from the pile by the dugout and wedged them upright into the sleds, then nailed the top straight into the beam. It wasn't permanent, but it was enough. The groans stopped before dawn. The shell held, and the morning air smelled less like smoke and more like the inside of a breath, stale but living. In town, 5 roofs had caved. 1 woman died, crushed under her own rafters while trying to rescue her dog. 2 children lost fingers. The general store had been locked for 3 days, and the blacksmith hadn't been seen since Tuesday. But the McKinley place stood. The question of food came next, not how much they had. June had calculated that long ago, but how long it would last with so many mouths. They still had sacks of dried beans, 3 barrels of salted pork and cornmeal packed in cotton flour bags. But with 26 people sleeping in the layers, those numbers no longer felt safe. So she started rationing. 1 ladle of stew per person, cornbread cut in quarters, pork only on Sundays. It made her the villain to some, but they kept eating, and it was Tobias who made it bearable. One night he brought June a bowl with 1 extra carrot floating in it, just 1. "I snuck it from the soup," he whispered, grinning. "Don't be mad." She didn't yell. She didn't scold. She didn't even look up. She just let the heat of it rest in her hands a while before setting it down untouched. He never did it again. But after that, someone, maybe Tobias, maybe not, started carving shapes into the dugout beams. A horse, a fire, a girl with her hair in braids, hope scratched into wood. The real scare came during the second freeze. The first had been snow, the second was wind, and it came with a howl no one had heard before. Not the cry of a coyote or the whistle through a stovepipe, but something lower, longer, like a scream from the ground itself. It blew for 6 hours, tore tarps off lean-tos across the valley, and peeled the skin off one of the dugout walls. The fire went out in the northern chamber. That was when one of the children, the clubfoot girl, stopped breathing. They found her blue, breath shallow, skin damp with cold sweat. Isaac carried her into the barn layer where the fire was stronger, wrapped her in every coat they had, and June fed her drops of hot water through a cloth. She lived, but she lost 2 toes. After that, June told Ezra to double all fire shifts, and Isaac dug a new pit, deeper, closer to the original cabin. "We'll make a stove tunnel," he said. "Tie it to the outer vents." June raised an eyebrow. "You learned how to do that?" Isaac shrugged. "I watched you." She didn't smile, but she let him do it. That tunnel kept the dugouts 10 degrees warmer by the following week. Then came the man with the gun, not wild, not starving, armed. He came alone, dragging a sled with 2 children wrapped in furs. He banged the barn door 3 times with the butt of his rifle and waited. June watched him from the lookout hatch. She saw how he stood, too straight, too calm, not desperate like the others, controlled. She stepped outside, axe in hand. "I don't like guns at my door," she said. He didn't raise it. "I'm not looking for trouble. You brought it." He nodded toward the children. "They need heat. I've kept them alive for weeks. But I'm out of fat wood, and I heard about this place." "You didn't come with nothing," June said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sack. Inside, jerky, coffee, and a tin of lard. "I'm trading," he said. June stared at the gun. "Leave that here." He paused, then unbuckled the strap, laid it on the snow. They let him in. That night, they counted 32 souls within the McKinley shell. June sat by the stove, staring at the flames as if they might whisper the next answer. Tobias was asleep, Isaac patching another canvas wall. Ezra sharpened a nail into a hook, and the snow outside fell silent. No laughter anymore, only the weight of surviving. The silence had weight now. Not the still, clean kind of silence folks wrote about in books, but a silence that groaned like a dying floorboard and pressed in on you from all sides. It was the kind of silence you noticed when your breath clouded up and didn't fade right, when the air stayed too still, too thick, too ready to listen. It wasn't peace, it was waiting, and that waiting stretched on for 10 more days. 10 days without anyone knocking, without any new arrivals dragging sleds or carrying children. 10 days without birds overhead or foxes yipping in the dark. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that time, the structure around the McKinley cabin transformed again. Isaac began calling it the hive. "We got workers, we got drones, we got a queen in the middle," he said once, half grinning at June. She didn't reply, but she didn't correct him either, because it was true, in a way neither of them liked to name. The inner cabin, their cabin, had become sacred ground. No one entered unless June allowed it. The stove inside remained the warmest, most efficient heat source in the entire sprawl, and every inch of it mattered. They boiled water there in shifts. They made medicines with melted snow and wild sage kept in a jar from summer. They dried cloths and made poultices and quietly cut the names of the dead into the underside of the old wood table. 2 had died. One, the mad trapper Ezra had taken to calling sleeper, simply didn't wake one morning. Face peaceful, hands clasped over his belly like he'd been praying for rest. The other, one of the preacher's orphans, passed quietly in the dugout corner after vomiting blood through the night. They buried them under the north slope, deep in the snowpack where the ground had gone soft from the underground stove tunnel's warmth. Tobias carved the names into the wall himself. He didn't ask, he just did it. And when June found him, sitting on a stool, running a coal nub across the plank with silent care, she didn't say a word. She just set a wool blanket across his shoulders and left him to finish. The 8th day of silence brought the coldest night of the season. It hit like a dropped anvil, smashing the snow flat and cracking the ice along the creek tunnel. Isaac nearly lost a toe that night after slipping into the slush while checking a barrel trap. He crawled back up with his boot full of blood and water and refused to yell, even as June sliced his sock away and pressed heated cloths to his skin. "You should have waited for morning," she said, "and let it freeze over. I'd rather lose the fish than your foot." He didn't reply. But he didn't go back out the next day either. That night, June stayed awake. She sat by the hatch with the axe across her knees, watching the moonlight drag shadows across the crusted snow. She could feel it, something just past the trees. Not wolves, not strangers, but winter itself, not the kind on calendars, the kind her mother used to whisper about when the fire burned low and the windows frosted over. "Old White's walking," she'd say. "Old White's looking for cracks." It sounded foolish when June was small, not anymore, because this wasn't weather, it was siege, and Old White was circling. When the knock finally came, It was nearly dawn. A single knock, then another, then nothing. June opened the outer hatch to find a boy, maybe 14, thin as fence wire, fingers blue, hat gone. He didn't speak. Just raised a canvas-wrapped bundle from under his arm. Inside, a baby, alive but barely. The boy passed out before June could speak. Isaac helped carry him in. They laid him beside the inner wall, near the main stove. Tobias fetched extra wool from the dry pile. The baby didn't cry once, just wheezed. When the boy woke, hours later, he stared at June like he was dreaming. "We had a shed," he said hoarsely. "My ma kept the fire going with broken chairs." June handed him water. "How far'd you walk?" "North Fork. Took me all night." "How long since you ate?" He blinked. "Does snow count?" That night, they gave the boy stew. They wrapped the baby in a double quilt and laid it between heated stones. And for the first time in days, someone sang. It was the clubfoot girl, Cinder, Tobias still called her, sitting near the dugout fire, humming something wordless, the kind of tune that had no beginning and no end, just breath made warm. Others joined, not voices, not yet, but listening. The next morning, the roof cracked, a sound like lightning, right above the barn layer, where the original ridgepole still ran the length of the spine. June felt it through her boots, a shudder, a warning. She ran out, Isaac close behind, and they saw it. The north beam had bowed inward, snow weighing it like a boot on a chest. "Post it now," she snapped. "Wedge the fire sleds beneath and brace the east rib." Isaac shouted for help. Ezra appeared first, then two of the older boys from the dugout, and within minutes they were working, sliding posts into place, nailing crossbeams against the load, pushing back against winter's quiet assault. It held, but barely. They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the shell. Isaac and Tobias packed snow around the outer edges to insulate from wind shear. June patched weak joints with hide and straw, wrapping them like wounds. Ezra rebuilt the collapsed stovepipe that fed the barn layer, his hands raw from climbing the ice-slick frame. By dusk, the structure was tighter, firmer, but it would never be safe, just safer than outside. That night, June gathered everyone who could walk. They sat in the barn layer, cramped, surrounded by cracked beams and the smell of ash. She looked at them, faces yellowed by lamplight, eyes hollow with weeks of cold, and spoke without raising her voice. "I don't know how long this winter's going to last." No one moved. "I don't know if we'll have enough food, or wood, or if the roof will hold." A baby coughed in the back. The boy from the North Fork tightened his arms around it. "But I know this. We're alive because we work. Because we don't complain, because we don't let the cold decide what happens next." Silence again. Then Cinder's hand went up, quiet, trembling. "Yes," June said. "Can I teach Tobias how to mend socks?" Laughter. Real, fragile as breath on glass, but real. June allowed herself a smile. "You can teach him anything you want." In the days that followed, the hive became more than survival. It became a rhythm. Tobias fed the small ones and fetched snow to boil. Isaac mended walls and added new support posts. Ezra, now more lucid than any of them expected, became the de facto engineer, redrawing vents, improving airflow, and even designing a second stove from salvaged pipe and a cracked kettle. People stopped waiting for orders. They started offering help. The woman who'd arrived with Sarah Grange, a widow named Helen, took over food inventory. The miner's brother reinforced the outer walls with rope binding. Cinder taught the kids to repair their own mittens with cord and teeth-gritted patience. Even the clubfoot didn't slow her. By the time the year turned, they were 37. 37 people wrapped in layers of pine and tar and cloth and silence. And then came the avalanche. It started with a rumble, not a crack, not a howl, but something deeper, like the belly of the earth had begun to turn. June was at the creek tunnel, checking the frozen barrels, when the sound reached her. She dropped the bucket, ran barefoot through the snow back to the shell, and screamed before she reached the door. "Down! Get flat!" They heard it just before it hit. A roar, like the whole sky falling sideways. And then it did. Snow poured in from the east ridge, a sheet of white death, tumbling trees and crushing fences. It smothered two outbuildings, buried the woodpile, slammed into the outer dugout like a fist into cloth. But the shell held. The outer walls bowed, cracks opened, tarps tore, but it held. When the sound stopped, the world was white, silent again. They emerged slowly, June first, shovel in hand, Isaac behind her, dazed but breathing. The dugout was gone, flattened, but no one inside had died. Ezra had seen the slope begin to shift hours before. He'd warned them. They'd braced the roof, moved bodies inward, used the spare hay sleds as shock plates. It worked. By some miracle or stubborn will, it worked. The McKinley hive, the strange double-shelled fortress that started as a child's idea of a barn, was still standing, and now it was more than shelter. It was legend. By the time the avalanche settled into silence, No one in the valley was laughing, not even the ones who hadn't mocked the McKinley children to begin with. Because word had spread, the preacher had walked it down the slope on snowshoes the size of sleds, eyes still stunned by what he'd seen. He told them, in town, by the cracked stove of the church, to anyone who could still feel their toes, about the layered cabin, about the shell inside a shell, about the 3 children who had built what grown men couldn't, who had kept 37 people alive through a storm that had flattened roofs and barns, and even buried 2 cabins whole. But it wasn't just what they'd built, it was how. He told them how a tunnel still ran from the stove all the way to the dugout, keeping the earth warm like blood through a vein. He told them about the boy with no hat who'd dragged a baby across miles of ice, and how the little one now smiled in her sleep. He told them about the trapper who had nearly lost his mind, but was now drawing chimney maps on wood with a burned nail. He told them the cold had cracked bones, but not hearts. He told them the McKinleys hadn't asked for anything, not once. And by the time he was done, people in town started asking different questions. Not, are they still alive? But can we go? Because by then, half the valley had lost someone. A wife, a son, a dog, a house, and the McKinley place, that spider's nest, that fire-wrapped barn, had become the last light in a winter that didn't seem to end. June didn't want to let them come, not at first. She stood by the northern hatch, eyes tight, listening to the preacher's words, with arms crossed over her patched coat. "We've taken 37 already," she said. "We don't have the heat. They'll bring wood," the preacher said. "We don't have the food. They'll bring that too. They'll bring the cold." He didn't argue. He just said, "They'll die if you don't." June turned away, but later, alone in the dark, she looked down at Tobias. He was sleeping under the heavy buffalo hide, his lips slightly parted, his fingers curled around the corner of a quilt Cinder had sewn from coat scraps. He hadn't cried since the avalanche. He hadn't spoken much either. He just sat sometimes, eyes staring toward the dugout where it had been, as if listening for something no one else could hear. That night, June lit a candle, walked to the far wall, and scratched a line into the wood. 10 more, she wrote. Then below that, only 10. The first family arrived 2 days later. A man, his wife, and a daughter barely old enough to walk. They had a sled of supplies: beans, jerky, a sack of oats, and a dozen tin can lids they used for scooping snow. The man had no fingers on his right hand, lost to frostbite. He nodded when June opened the gate but didn't speak. June didn't smile, just motioned to the barn layer. "You sleep out here," she said. "No one enters the inner." They nodded. She pointed to the stove. "You feed it. It feeds you. You stop working. You freeze." Still, they nodded. The girl looked up and whispered, "It's warm." June handed her a chunk of fire-baked bread. The child wept. By January 10th, they had 46 people inside. The structure had grown to accommodate them, but barely. The third shell, the one Isaac and Ezra started calling the scarf, had been added in pieces, a lopsided L-shaped crawl space built along the windward side, filled with hay bales, crates, and half-frozen clay from the creek bed. It wasn't pretty, but it broke the wind, and it let them bring in 4 more children. "Any more and we collapse," Isaac said one night, staring at the beam over his head. "This wood wasn't meant for townsfolk." June didn't answer. She was watching Tobias scrape soot from the stove mouth with a twisted spoon, his lips moving softly. She didn't interrupt. She knew he'd taken to talking to the fire, like it was a person, like it had saved him once, and he was afraid it might leave. "The worst death came in the night." The mother of the girl who'd wept. She'd been coughing for days, a wet, rattling noise like boots trudging through mud. They'd kept her close to the warm wall, fed her stew, boiled pine needles in water to clear her chest. But it wasn't enough. She died with her eyes open, staring at a knothole in the roof. Her husband buried her under the moonlight. June didn't stop him, didn't offer help, just watched as he dug a trench with a cookpot and pressed his forehead to the earth when it was done. In the morning, the girl didn't cry. She just sat beside Tobias, watching him tend the fire, and he let her. He never let anyone help before. The next visitor wasn't from town. He came from the ridge. No sled, no children, just a hat pulled low and boots laced with rawhide. He stepped through the outer dugout after dark, silent as frost. June met him at the gate, axe in hand. "I heard you kept your stove lit," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" "Warmth. We don't take strangers without food." He reached into his coat and pulled out 3 strips of smoked elk. "Where'd you get that?" "Trapped north. Still game in the high valley." June motioned him inside. He didn't speak much, but he knew things. By dawn, he'd rebuilt the outer vent, improved the chimney draft, and reinforced the scarf layer with planks pulled from a broken ladder. Ezra watched him with narrowed eyes. "That man's lived colder than any of us," he muttered. June nodded. "He can stay, but no knives near the kids." The man stayed 3 nights, then vanished, left a bundle of elk jerky near the hatch, and a stone with a hole in it, hung on a strip of leather. Tobias kept it. Food was running low again. Even with the new supplies, the stomachs had outpaced the storage. Beans were nearly gone, jerky reduced to crumbs. Every child knew the rations by sight. That was when Isaac made the decision June couldn't. "I'm going out," he said one morning. June stood frozen. "You won't make it. There's a cabin out west, old Traither place, might still have supplies, or traps, anything. It's 2 miles through deep snow. You'll freeze." Isaac pulled his coat tight. "Then bury me in the scarf." Tobias ran to him, hugged him without words. Isaac didn't cry. June almost did. But instead she packed him a satchel, a flint, half a biscuit, a folded letter she didn't explain. "You come back before night," she said. "If I don't," she shoved the axe into his hand, "then don't die with your back to the wind." He left at dawn and didn't come back by dark. The hours dragged. The barn was quiet. The scarf layer felt colder. Even the stove burned slower. Tobias refused to eat. The girl who'd lost her mother sat with him, silent. Ezra mumbled about wolves. June stared at the door. She didn't sleep, not once. She sat at the hatch, forehead pressed to the cold wood, waiting. When the knock came, it was weak. 3 taps. Then one more. She flew to the door and yanked it open. Isaac collapsed into her arms, covered in frost, eyes glassy. He had 2 rabbits in one hand, a sack of oats in the other, and a bite mark on his leg. But he was alive. She fed him broth for 3 days, made him sleep beside the stove, burned the cloth she used to dress his wound. "I didn't run," he whispered once. She looked down. "I know." He didn't speak again until he could stand. But when he did, he walked straight to the scarf layer and started bracing the roof, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. By February, the structure had a name. People in town had started calling it the Shell, capital S, whispered like a shrine. June didn't care. She cared about the beams, the food count, the way Tobias had started carving notches in the wall for every day they survived. She cared about the next storm, because winter wasn't done yet. It was just sharpening its teeth. It was the kind of cold that made glass weep. By February's 2nd week, ice began forming on the inside of the outermost walls. Water buckets froze solid before dawn, even those closest to the scarf layer fire pits. Chimney smoke rose sluggishly, curling down instead of up, as if the sky had turned thick with refusal. And inside the shell, now a fortress in all but name, heat had become more than life. It had become order. Every hour had its duty. Every name had a role. Food wasn't just rationed, it was scheduled. Fires weren't tended randomly. They rotated by age and strength, never by pity. Even sleep was taken in shifts, the strongest sleeping last, and the children always closest to the middle warmth. June enforced it all, with a voice that never shouted, a face that never cracked, and a memory like stone. She remembered how much flour was left, who had taken the extra wool patch, which child had skipped their oat portion the day before, and how many days since the last stranger knocked, because no one was knocking anymore. The blizzard that arrived on February 13th made sure of that. It started with a sound like the wind had cracked its back. The entire valley seemed to vanish. The trees disappeared into whiteness. The snow fell not in flakes but in clumps, thick, wet, fast and endless. Drifts piled up past doorframes in an hour. Tunnels collapsed. Ropes snapped. The main creek tunnel, the one that ran low toward the frozen water line, caved in completely. Isaac barely crawled out before the whole roof gave way. "We're sealed in," Ezra said that night, sitting with his hands wrapped in wool, staring at the door as if it were the mouth of something dead. "Nothing's getting in or out." June didn't disagree. She just added more cloth to the walls and ordered double fire shifts. But she knew the truth. This storm wasn't like the others. This storm had come to end things. 3 days into the whiteout, the outer scarf layer collapsed. The roof buckled first. Too much weight, too little angle. Ezra and the boy from North Fork were inside when it gave way. They didn't die, but they didn't get out clean either. Ezra's ribs cracked. The boy's leg was pinned under a beam. June and Isaac dug them free with kitchen pots and frying pans, hauling snow like sand from a flooding hole. When they finally pulled them out, the boy couldn't stand, and Ezra's breath rattled like leaves in a dying tree. "We need a new plan," Isaac said, panting. Snow caked in his eyebrows. "We need to cut the scarf off. Let it go. It'll expose the fire pit," June said. "Then we move the pit." "Where?" Isaac looked up, past the cracked boards of the second layer, toward the original cabin wall. "In." They did it by lamplight. They opened the wall of the original barn layer, not the outermost scarf, not the dugout, but the layer June had sworn she'd never change, and dug a trench straight to the base of the inner cabin. Isaac hauled the pit bricks. June laid the iron scrap. Tobias brought dry twigs in his shirt like a bird building its final nest. And for the first time since the first frost, they let the fire crawl back into the center. It wasn't pride anymore. It was survival. The dugouts were lost. The scarf layer was crushed. The creek tunnel was buried. They had one shell left. the middle one. And so they thickened it, packed straw between boards, added a new ceiling of overlapping coats and quilt scraps. They took down every wall that didn't hold weight and turned it into warmth, firewood from supports, canvas from privacy screens. Even the preacher's old altar, hauled in weeks earlier, was burned. There were no sermons now, only breathing. By day 5, the air was so still that voices echoed off the ceiling. Cinder's cough had returned, deeper this time. Her fingers trembled when she tried to stitch mittens. She couldn't feel the needle anymore. "I'm fine," she whispered, always the same. But Tobias knew. He brought her his own socks, the ones with the thicker seams. He didn't ask if she wanted them. He just set them beside her, then sat and stared at the fire, as if daring it to go out. 2 more died during the whiteout, one quietly in sleep, the man with no fingers, the one who'd brought his daughter and wife and lost the latter before New Year's. June found him near the 3rd vent, slumped forward, arms crossed like he'd just meant to rest for a moment. The other, Ezra, he didn't die easy. The rib had punctured his lung, and for 2 days he bled slow and whispered things no one understood. He tried to rebuild the chimney draft with nothing but nails and ash. June held his hand as he went, her fingers wrapped tight, jaw clenched hard. "You got us this far," she told him. His final word was heat. They burned his body, not out of cruelty, out of need. It kept them warm for 7 hours. No one spoke of it, not even Tobias. By the 8th day, the storm finally broke, the wind dropped, the sky lightened, and the frost on the inner beams began to melt, not fast, not enough to hope, but enough to know the world still moved. June was the first to open the hatch. She pressed her eye to the hide-covered slit and blinked. There was light, white, brutal light, like a blade across the eyes. The snow had buried the outer 2 layers entirely. Only the barn shell and cabin remained. But above, the sky had cracked open. Clouds thinned. A bird, drifted past on uncertain wings. She opened the outer door and fell to her knees. Snow came pouring in, but it didn't bite, not like before. The storm had passed. They weren't safe, but they were alive. That day, they began to dig out. Isaac cut a new tunnel up toward the surface. The preacher helped, still silent since Ezra's death. June rationed the last of the oats. Cinder finally smiled again when Tobias found a stub of sugar buried in the crate bottom and shared it with her in secret. The mood inside the shell changed, not to joy, but to resolve. There was more digging ahead, more frost, more hunger, but they'd survived what others hadn't, not by luck, but by the walls they built, the warmth they guarded, the silence they respected. The fire stayed lit, even when the walls around it died, even when the world outside went white. The dig-out took 9 days, 9 days of hauling snow by hand in soot-blackened pans, using sleds with broken runners, cutting through wind-packed drifts so dense they rang like wood when struck with a spade. No one waited for orders. They just moved, quietly, together, like the shell had breathed life into their joints and wouldn't let them stop. The first break in the snow came when Isaac hit open air with the axe. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden burst, just a soft shift of light in the powder, the difference between grave and morning. He shoved a hole wide and stuck his hand into the sky. June was behind him, her boots half frozen, her coat now patched with 4 different colors of cloth. She climbed beside him and blinked into the pale blue. It was colder than ever, but it was over. The worst of it, anyway. They could see the sun, and in the wild west of winter, that was enough to build a future on. They opened the new entrance slowly, carved steps up the slope, braced with cut planks from the broken scarf layer. It emerged just beside the blackened stump where the first tarp line had once been, the place Tobias called the start. The town below was changed. Snow covered nearly everything. Cabins were buried up to the roofline. Smoke rose from only half the chimneys. Tracks were few and scattered, the prints of desperate men or half-dead animals. It didn't look like a town anymore. It looked like a memory. June stood at the ridge above the shell and stared down at what was left. The McKinleys were no longer at the edge of the world. They were the center of it. By February's final week, people began arriving again. They came slowly, awkwardly, blinking at the strange, stitched-together shape that loomed from the snow like a beast asleep. The shell no longer resembled anything a sane man would call a house. It had layers upon layers of mismatched wood, beam stubs like ribs jutting out, black vents like eyes, and a tunnel for a mouth. But smoke rose steadily from its center, and warmth lived inside it still. The preacher stood at the entrance as the first of them came, a man with one arm, a woman dragging a sled of dry moss, a young boy in boots too big, all silent, all shivering. June watched from the barn layer, Tobias beside her, Cinder holding his hand. They were down to the last sack of flour, and she let them in anyway. The inside of the shell had changed since the avalanche, not just structurally, emotionally. People didn't whisper anymore. They listened. The rules had become ritual. Even the children kept a schedule without prompting. They swept floors with broken brooms. They stoked fires with twig bundles. They told stories only when June allowed it, and even then no one talked about before, only about now. They had survived by becoming something else, not a family, not a town, a body with a heart of flame. Isaac began building new vents. He used leftover stovepipe, hollowed logs, even bits of tin scavenged from broken lanterns. He drew maps now, full charcoal plans of how to keep the air moving and the heat from pooling. June watched him and saw the boy he was slip away. He had become a builder, and he would never be just a child again. Tobias stopped sleeping beside the stove. He now slept near the outer wall, where the littlest children were. They curled around him like he was a blanket with a beating heart. When one cried, he woke. When someone coughed, he brought water. He didn't wait for June's instruction. He was instruction now. And June, she stopped sleeping altogether for 3 nights. Not because she was afraid, but because she was planning. The plan wasn't grand. It was simple. Dig a supply route. Not back to town, the town was dying, but through the ridge, toward the river bend where elk had once crossed. If they could reach the bend, they might find meat. If they could reach the bend, they might not starve. And so they began. Isaac led the dig. 4 strong enough to wield spades followed. Ezra's chimney draft drawings, kept rolled in a cloth, his name etched in the corner, became tunnel diagrams now. Each foot of snow cleared was a foot of hope earned. Each foot of snow was life. The dig lasted 4 more days. They broke through to the bend on March 1st, and the first thing they saw was tracks, animal tracks, fresh, deep, measured. A herd had passed just a day before. June fell to her knees in the snow, hands shaking, heart hammering, not because of the meat, but because life still moved beyond the shell. The world hadn't ended, it had just hidden. They set traps. They caught 2 rabbits, then a fox, then, miraculously, a small doe that had stumbled in the deep snow and broken its leg. They hauled it home like gold. The shell feasted for the first time in over 2 months. No one overate. They weren't fools, but they smiled, and it was real. By the 2nd week of March, the melt had begun. Not fast, not visible, but felt in the air, in the tone of the snow, in the way footsteps no longer echoed so loudly through the shell. It was a melt of the spirit, too. Cinder began stitching again. Tobias told a story. Isaac made a joke, a real one. And June, she stepped outside each morning now, just stood there, hands in pockets, listening, waiting for the world to return. They lost one more before the thaw, the old man who had refused to give his name. He passed in his sleep, smiling. They buried him with Ezra's nail. Tobias placed it in his hand. "I think he earned it," he said. No one disagreed. March 17th, a wagon creaked up the ridge trail, the first in months, drawn by 2 skeletal mules and driven by a man with a preacher's collar and a rifle strapped across his lap. He brought news. The town had burned. Not all of it, but most. A fire started in the blacksmith's place when a stovepipe cracked. No one could fight it. Water froze before it left the bucket. The church survived. So did 5 cabins, but the rest was gone. June listened, jaw tight. The man looked around the shell, eyes wide. "You built this?" She nodded. He tipped his hat. "Reckon the shell's the new church now." She didn't smile. But she didn't argue either. By March's end, the shell had taken in 53 people. Some lived in the dugouts again, now redug and reinforced. Some helped Isaac build a 2nd tunnel to the high bend, where spring runoff had already begun. Some tended a garden plot June marked out on the slope, shoveling old snow away to let the earth think of blooming. But most simply lived, woke, worked, slept, and carried on. Not like survivors, but like believers. Believers in heat, in walls, in one girl's fire. On the first true spring morning, Tobias ran barefoot across the thawed patch near the west wall. He shouted, and people came running. The first green had bloomed, a sprig of clover, tiny and shivering, but alive. He pointed to it, eyes huge. "It came back," he said. No one replied. They just knelt beside it and breathed. Inside the shell that night, the fire still burned, still steady, still strong, and for the first time in 94 days, no one had a nightmare, because the shell had held and the laughter had long since died. But warmth had won. By April, the snow no longer ruled. It lingered in shadows and low places, crusted over old fence posts and drifted against hollow tree trunks. But its grip was broken. The sun was different now. Not just light, but heat, real heat, crawling down into the shell's roof slats and pressing through every crack like the first whisper of forgiveness. And forgiveness was exactly what the shell carried. Forgiveness for everyone who'd once laughed. Forgiveness for the woman who ran out of stew and didn't share. Forgiveness for the children who stole crusts when no one looked. Forgiveness even for the land, which had tried so hard to kill them and had now finally relented. But June didn't forget. She forgave the cold, but she remembered every body buried in the ridge, every finger lost to frost, every fire fed with furniture and fence post and faith, because memory was survival too. The shell changed again, not by choice, but by weather. As the melt deepened, the scarf layer, long since ruined, sloughed away in chunks. Dugouts collapsed in on themselves, becoming slushy pits too dangerous to step in. The barn layer sagged with wet weight, logs spongy from weeks of ice. But the cabin remained. The heart, the core, the very first walls, built by June's father when Tobias was still crawling and Isaac still afraid of thunder. They were still standing, the only part that never bowed, never cracked, never wept. They had become something more than wood. They were proof. Word reached them by foot. A woman from the west, lean as a fence post, wearing boots tied with vine and a hat made from stitched wolf hide. "The ferry's running again," she told June, "over by Willow Crossing." She'd heard from the next town over, survivors gathering, rebuilding, planning a communal granary and a new church with double-thick stone walls. "You should come," she said. "You'd be safer there." June stared at her, then looked around, at the cabin, at the patched barn ribs, the broken scarf beams, the tunnels, the small green chutes beginning to push up between half-melted drifts. At the people, 53 of them still alive, still moving. Some were laying sod over the dugout again. Some were building a platform for planting, using Ezra's chimney slats. Tobias was sitting by the new stove, telling the youngest ones how to layer mittens so frost wouldn't creep in at the wrists. June turned back to the woman. "We are safe," she said, and that was the end of that. With the melt came hunger again, trapped animals thawed out of the snow, rabbits stiff like forgotten dolls, the occasional deer curled into the shape of prayer. The children were told not to touch them. Rot had teeth no one could see, but fresh kills began to appear too. Small herds of elk returned to the valley edge, nosing through patches of exposed moss. Isaac, now the designated hunter, went out every morning before light with Tobias trailing behind. He taught his younger brother how to track properly, how to walk quiet, how to breathe slow. They brought home meat 3 days out of 7. And no one asked how they killed it. June did not need to know. The shell was still fed. That was enough. On the 7th week of melt, a stranger arrived at dusk. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just stood by the edge of the ridge with one hand on a crooked walking stick and the other held up toward the sky like he was measuring the sun. He watched the shell for nearly an hour, then turned to leave. It was Tobias who saw him, who ran to June, breathless, face flushed. "There's a man, with one eye." She came out herself. He was still there, old, maybe 70, beard gone to snow, a long coat of sewn hides and boots made from tarp, stitched over bone. "Yours?" he asked, gesturing to the shell. "Ours," she thought. She nodded once. He looked at it again. "Smart. Too smart. My cabin's halfway gone." "I dug under and nearly drowned when the melt came." June said nothing. "Mind if I borrow the idea?" he asked. "Not the whole thing, just the inside of the outside." She blinked, then, without smiling, said, "Use 2 walls. 3 if you can, and never let the fire sleep." He tipped his head like a king to a queen and walked off into the trees. Tobias watched him go, chewing the inside of his cheek. "He's gonna try to build one." "He already has," June said. "He'll get it wrong. He'll learn." Spring came in slow, 1 week at a time. The creek turned black with runoff, tunnels filled with worms. Wildflowers dared to bloom at the hill's base, only to be crushed by one last April snow. But the people inside the shell had stopped hoping for miracles. They worked. June taught them to dry herbs. Isaac showed them how to brace with ropes instead of beams. Tobias wrote names on the wall for those who had no graves. Cinder began building a cot for the girl whose father never came back. She didn't ask permission. No one stopped her. One day, June woke and realized it was warm. Not fire warm, air warm. She stepped outside and didn't shiver. The ground was wet. Mud sucked at her boots. Her breath no longer fogged. She walked to the ridge and looked down at the valley. Smoke rose from 4 cabins. Children were outside, running, barefoot and wild. Someone had painted a door red, and in the far distance, she saw a long black wagon, the kind used for hauling seed. Life was returning, and still the shell stood, scarred, tilted, but proud. That night, Tobias asked the question none of them had dared say aloud. "Are we going to leave it?" The shell, the home they'd built from memory and pain and frozen wood. June didn't answer right away. She sat with her hand on the stove, fingers spread wide, eyes far away. Then, "Not yet," he nodded. She looked at him. "But maybe someday, even if it's still warm? Even then." "Why?" She didn't blink. "Because there's more than warmth." He didn't understand. Not yet. But he would. The preacher left first, left a note, left his Bible behind too. the pages too warped by smoke and time to read, but the cover still held. He wrote only one thing. They laughed. You didn't. June burned the note but kept the book. By late April, the shell was no longer needed. The outer layers were taken down, beam by beam, to be turned into fences and barns and planting beds. The dugouts were collapsed and filled with compost. Even the second shell, the barn, was slowly deconstructed. The space between walls had gone still. There were no more mouths to feed by firelight. The cabin alone remained, the heart, and that was enough. One night, June stood in the doorway and watched Tobias sleep. He'd grown taller, so had Cinder. Isaac had a beard now, and a limp that would never leave. June still kept her axe near the stove, but she no longer woke every hour. She no longer counted the food sacks at midnight. She no longer listened for cracks in the roof. The shell had done its job. They were safe, and spring was real, but she never forgot. Not the first knock, not the night the scarf fell, not the man who traded warmth for jerky, not Ezra's hand reaching for the draft diagram with blood on his teeth. Not the sound of Tobias telling the fire to please stay alive. She never forgot any of it, and neither did they. The shell was gone, not gone like vanished, gone like shed skin, like something left behind when you outgrew the part of yourself that could die. They had taken it down, one board at a time, starting with the sagging scarf beams, the wind-bent dugout frames, the warped planks from the barn layer that had blackened from weeks of smoke and frost. The last pieces of it, the ones June had refused to touch until spring fully came, were hauled off in silence by Isaac and two others who had dug graves the previous month. They didn't burn any of it. They repurposed every single beam, every tar strip, every fraying length of cloth. By mid-May, it had become new fences, tool sheds, chicken pens. The heavy posts from the scarf layer framed a new smokehouse at the far edge of the clearing. The last tarp, the very first one Tobias had dragged behind him like a cape the summer before, became a roof over the cook tent. And the cabin itself? It stayed, shrunk now, stripped back to its original bones. The stove inside still burned, but only in the mornings, and even then, more out of memory than need. They no longer called it the shell. It was just the cabin again. But those who'd lived there knew better. It was the place that saved them all. By the time May ended, people came up from town nearly every day, not for shelter. They didn't need it anymore, but for advice. How'd you brace the outer walls? What angle did you use on the snow vents? What did you use for glue when the pitch ran out? June answered some of the questions. Isaac answered more. Tobias watched and whispered answers under his breath like spells, like he was afraid if he stopped saying them, winter might return. They helped others build new homes, homes with air gaps, homes with inner cores, homes that learned the lesson the shell had taught. But no one ever built one quite the same, because no one else had built it with fear, with loss, with the kind of hunger that started in the belly and ended in the soul. Only they had done that, and only they had paid the price. Cinder began walking without her crutch. She still limped, her ankle clicked on cold mornings, but she refused help. I helped build that tunnel, she said one day, when Isaac offered her his arm. I'll walk through it without anyone holding me now. Isaac nodded. They both smiled, and for the first time, June thought maybe this isn't where it ends. The preacher never came back. His Bible stayed on the shelf, warped, fire-smudged, unreadable in parts. Tobias asked if they should bury it. No, June said. It was buried already. Now it watches. And she meant it, because in the shell, everything had watched, even the stove, especially the stove. There were days when June thought about tearing the cabin down entirely, just walking out, like the man with the one eye had done, and leaving it all behind. But she never did, because something had grown in that place. Not just heat, not just survival, but order. Order out of madness, community from isolation, a plan from panic. That wasn't something you could walk away from, so she stayed, and so did most of the others. In late June, a man came from the government. He wore clean boots, a white hat, carried a ledger. He called it a census, said he was collecting names, ages, dates of birth, trying to map out who'd lived, who'd died, who'd made it through the worst winter in 30 years. When he reached June, he asked her name. June McKinley. Head of household? I guess. He paused, looked up from his paper. That was you. The barn cabin up on the ridge? She didn't answer. He smiled, impressed. They say that thing kept 50 people alive. 53, he whistled. You must have had help. A lot of help. She looked down at the dirt. I had heat. He scratched his notes. Is the cabin still there? Yes. You planning to leave? No. He blinked. Why not? She didn't speak. He waited, then nodded. Understood. He left before dusk. Never asked what they'd burned that winter. Never saw the nail in the wall with Ezra's name beside it. Never noticed that every beam in the cabin was darker on the inside. By August, the valley had greened. Chickens wandered freely. The creek ran full and soft. Children played again, even laughed. And still, every morning, June lit the stove, even on warm days, even on hot ones. Tobias asked her once, "Why do we still light it?" She looked at him for a long time and finally said, "Because it remembers." And he understood, because so did he. The shell wasn't standing anymore, but it wasn't gone. It lived in the extra walls built into every new cabin, in the second chimneys, in the vent grates made from shoe metal and coat buttons, in the way people passed food without being told, in the way no one threw away cloth anymore. In the way June woke in the night sometimes and checked the roof, even when there were stars outside. The shell lived in all of that, and always would. Years later, people would talk about it like a legend. They'd say, "You remember that girl? The McKinley girl? She built a barn around her cabin and filled it with people?" And someone else would laugh and say, "A barn? Who builds a barn around a house?" And a third person, usually older, would shake their head and say, "You don't get it. She didn't build a barn. She built a fire." And they'd all go quiet, because they knew, and those who'd lived through it would never forget, the snow, the hunger, the shell, the silence inside the wind, and the girl who stood between the world and the cold and didn't let it in.